Welcome to the second episode in a Legendarium series about the great women of Anglo-Saxon England. Today we'll be talking about Lady Aethelflaed of Mercia. Over the course of the presentation, we'll be talking about how she became a queen of a kingdom on the front lines of the Viking Wars, her relationship with King Ethelred of Mercia, how she eventually became ruler in her own right, how she carried Mercian conquests all the way to the river Humber, and the legacy that she left behind. Lady Aethelflaed was born in the year 869 to King Alfred the Great of Wessex. She was not born to a country at peace. In the 800s, England was burning from repeated Viking raids that could very well have turned England into Greater Daneland. This was helped by the fact that England was not yet England, but divided into several kingdoms, with the largest being Wessex in the south, Northumbria in the north, not surprisingly, and Mercia in the Midlands. All English kingdoms had been targets of Viking raiders for generations. The raiding grew more intense each year until the arrival of what the Anglo-Saxons called the Great Heathen Army in 865 AD. A group of 1,000 Vikings under Halfdan Ragnarsson and Ivar the Boneless came not just to raid, but to conquer and settle. By 870, the Norse had conquered Northumbria and East Anglia and were targeting Wessex. Their progress southwards was finally halted by King Alfred the Great at the Battle of Edington, a 6-day clash in which the Anglo-Saxons overcame the Vikings. As a child, Lady Aethelflaed was surely aware of the great goings-on. After all, King Alfred the Great brought his daughter up to be a well-educated young lady. King Alfred's decision to educate his daughters is all the more striking because noble-born girls were typically only educated if they were intended to enter the church. Aethelflaed was brought up in an atmosphere of piety, scholarship, and devotion to family and country. Despite that, her married life would be decided by the political needs of her father. As Alfred began to push the Vikings out of Wessex and moved in to free his northern ally Mercia, Alfred decided to make a gesture that would re-cement the long-standing alliance between Wessex and Mercia. So he married off his daughter Aethelflaed to King Ethelred of Mercia, and thus it was that despite being only 16 years old at the time of her marriage, Lady Aethelflaed found herself ruling a kingdom on the front lines of the Viking Wars. However, this may have been an opportunity for Aethelflaed, as Wessex didn't even grant the king's wife the title of queen, while Mercia, on the other hand, had a long tradition of women being involved in the practical business of running and, if necessary, defending a kingdom. Within a few years, King Ethelred and Lady Aethelflaed had their first and only child, a daughter named Elfwin. During the first 10 years of her reign, the Mercian royal family took back huge swaths of Mercia. Lady Aethelflaed was closely involved in both military and political efforts. She even came up with the tactic of fortifying the Mercian borders as they advanced, building new walls and hill forts to hold newly gained land against the inevitable Viking counterattacks. One of the most famous battles of this era was against a band of Vikings who gathered outside the city of Chester. Ironically, these Vikings were refugees who fled Dublin after an uprising by the native Irish against Viking rule. And while the refugees were allowed into Mercia after swearing to follow the king's laws, well, they soon forgot their promise and gathered in an army to lay siege to the city of Chester. Lady Aethelflaed herself took command of the situation, coming up with a cunning battle plan. She ordered her commanders to march the troops out the gates and engage the Vikings outside the city walls. After a brief fight, the Mercians faked a retreat inside the Chester city walls, allowing the Vikings to come through the gates. And once the Vikings were inside, the Mercians slammed the gate shut, and then a second force waiting in ambush rained arrows and stones upon the Vikings. Lady Aethelflaed's commanders followed her orders to the letter, and the Dublin Vikings were wiped out. Lady Aethelflaed's courage and cunning were undoubtedly impressive, but it does make one wonder where her husband was. Well, after those first 10 years of war, King Ethelred's health went into decline, and Lady Aethelflaed wasn't just running military campaigns, but carrying out peace treaties and church-building projects all in her own name. For 9 years, King Ethelred lingered until he finally died in the year 911. After King Ethelred's death, the nobles of Mercia accepted Lady Aethelflaed as sole ruler with the title Lady of Mercia. By the time that Aethelflaed became sole ruler of Mercia, her father Alfred the Great had died and her brother Edward the Elder had become the King of Wessex. Brother and sister monarchs both inherited their father's dream of a united England free of Viking raiders, and they would spend the rest of their lives finishing their father's work. The sibling monarchs joined in an alliance and pushed further north into lands still held by the Vikings. Mercian and Wessex men tore through the north, targeting Viking settlements in hit-and-run raids, cutting down the grain of the Norse settlers to leave their lords with nothing to eat, and nothing to feed their army with. However, the Vikings, knowing what would happen if these raids continued, responded with revenge raids from their own power base in York. They swept south, looting and burning as they went. Lady Aethelflaed and King Edward the Elder gathered their forces and struck back at the Battle of Wetnessfield, and in the West Midlands, they utterly annihilated the northern Vikings, shifting the fortunes of war firmly in favor of the English. For a time, Lady Aethelflaed enjoyed peace. However, she did not remain idle. Over the following years, she focused on fortifying many Mercian towns like Bridgenorth, Stafford, and the historic capital of Tamworth to keep the roads and rivers safe against Viking warbands. However, she did not do one particular thing which must have surprised her nobles. Lady Aethelflaed did not remarry. Why not? Because a new husband would become her lord, with the right to rule Mercia, now much larger thanks to her efforts. However, Aethelflaed had another reason not to remarry. In the Christian literature of the time, a celibate woman was considered to be more manly, and thus would be taken more seriously by the rough-and-ready fighting men of the age. But in the year 916, Lady Aethelflaed and King Edward the Elder went on the offensive again. Since the Vikings still ruled Wales, she headed west and crushed them in a series of battles. Then she moved north to Derby and Leicester, winning more victories by 918. And while she likely didn't fight in these battles herself, Lady Aethelflaed often appeared with the troops, personally developing strategy. And by late 918, Lady Aethelflaed's armies arrived at the river Humber. The great Viking stronghold of York saw the wind blowing firmly in England's direction and decided to pledge loyalty to Lady Aethelflaed. She prepared to ride north from Tamworth to receive homage from York when she became ill. Her health deteriorated fast, and she died just 2 weeks before she had planned to arrive in the city of York. Lady Aethelflaed was buried in St. Oswald's Church, a building that she herself had helped to finance. Aethelflaed was succeeded by her daughter Elfwin, then only 15 years old, who hoped to rule as queen as her mother had. However, though Lady Aethelflaed's accomplishments had been quite impressive, they happened in large part because of the support of King Edward the Elder, ruler of the larger and wealthier kingdom of Wessex. Indeed, Mercia had always been considered a sort of junior partner to Wessex ever since the great Viking invasions of the 800s had devastated Mercia. Perhaps with that in mind, King Edward the Elder seized his own niece Elfwin, stole her throne, and then stashed her in a nunnery so that she couldn't have any children who might grow up to inherit his throne one day. His rank ingratitude to his own niece is fairly shocking and shouldn't be excused. However, by making Mercia a part of Wessex, Edward the Elder went a long way towards realizing his father's dream of a single English kingdom united against Viking aggression. Indeed, both he and his successor Aethelstan would finally realize the goal of a single Anglo-Saxon kingdom, but without Lady Aethelflaed's successes, neither of them would have been able to achieve this. Now, given this extraordinary success, it seems strange that we don't know Lady Aethelflaed's name better today. Why is this the case? Well, first of all, a lot of the chronicles tended to be written by monks, who, in general, were not big fans of women holding that much power. In addition, our main source of history from this time is the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which was kept by the kings of Wessex. First Alfred the Great, and then his son Edward the Elder, and it's not surprising that these kings of Wessex wanted to celebrate their own achievements rather than those of a Mercian queen. And as the status of women began to decline, as Europe went from the rough and ready early Middle Ages to the relatively genteel and cultured High Middle Ages, women were relegated more and more to the house, the family, and the church. And perhaps the chroniclers didn't want women getting ideas about what they might do outside of what men now judged to be their proper place. And that wraps things up for this episode of The Legendarium. I hope that you enjoyed it. If you liked what you saw, press like. If you want to see more, press subscribe. If you've got anything to say, please let me know in the comment section. Thanks again for joining me, and I hope that you have a great rest of the day.